In other video demonstrations, we've talked about using different selection tools to select different areas of the screen, usually image-based selections where you're selecting objects from within a photograph. In this presentation, I want to look more at using channels of information to create selections. Now, selections are channels, so we're familiar with that. By way of review, if I use the rectangular selection tool, I select an area of the screen. I could hold down the Shift key to add to it, hold down the Alt key to subtract from it. When I have something I like, I can save it, and I go to Channels and hit Save, and there it is. If I want to look at that, that's a black and white grayscale representation of the selection that I made. If I want to load that selection, I can just Control click, or on a Mac it'd be Command click, I believe, and that reloads the selection. If I want to go back to the image, I have to make sure I click on RGB, so I'm seeing the full RGB image. Click on Layers, and I can do something with that. One thing I could do would be to let me create a new layer and just fill that with black is fine. All right, so now deselect. I have a layer, and it has a channel associated with it, which is the transparency of the layer. If I hide the image in the background, you see that this layer with the black shape is surrounded by transparency. That transparency is represented by a channel. That's a channel of information. If I want to reload that, I can just Control click on the image in the layers, and you see that it has reloaded the selection, and I can do something else with it. One less often used technique in terms of combining selections is to use the Shift and Alt keys at the same time. Let me reload the selection here. So this is based on the transparency of the layer. And I have the rectangular marquee tool. Let me go ahead and just mix it up, use the elliptical marquee tool. And I want to create a selection which is like a quarter round slice out of this. So with that selection in place, I'm going to hold down Alt and Shift and drag out another selection, and the result is where those two selections intersect. So the original selection based on the transparency, and then the circle, and this is what the new selection looks like. So this is selecting the part of the channel from one selection that's also in the other selection. So you have two channels of information, and what you end up with is what's in both of them. Now we're going to be using that a little bit differently. So we have transparency channels that we can load as selections by Control clicking. I could create a layer mask here over this, and it's just white, but I could then go in and put a gradient over this to fade it from top to bottom, for instance. So if I wanted this to, well, I've got the radial selection. Let me go to linear here. So if I wanted this to fade in from top to bottom, I could put a gradient in the layer mask. So the layer mask is a channel that has information for how transparent every pixel is. Now this layer already had a transparency channel showing which pixels were transparent. Now laid over that is another level of transparency indicated by a layer mask. Now if I want to look at the layer mask, I can Alt click on it here. So this is what that layer mask looks like. Alt click on it again to see the final result. Now, because this is a grayscale image that we can look at, we can also draw on that. In fact, I could just grab a brush here and draw on this. hit X to switch to black, draw on this. Now if I want to go back to look at the image, I can alt-click on that, and here you see where I drew with black, it becomes transparent. Where I drew with white, the black shape became opaque. And I could also draw on it here. Let me make the brush bigger. And so a layer mask is a grayscale image, and as a grayscale image, it is a single channel of information representing, well, you can look at it as representing grayscale, black to white, but it's being used to represent the transparency of this layer. A selection is a very similar thing. If I control-click on the layer mask, I've just loaded that layer mask as a selection. And I could select a color. Well, it's in grayscale here. Let me select the image. When you have a channel selected, you can only draw in black and white or grayscale. Here I want to add color to this layer, so I'm going to do a fill, foreground color. So now I've done a fill based on this selection I loaded from the layer mask. Okay, so I loaded the channel, which was a layer mask, as a selection and used it to fill part of the screen. So these are all interchangeable things. Let me go ahead and throw that away. So this is review for a lot of you, hopefully. I have a few different images here that I loaded in to use for different things. This is kind of not much color here, but different shapes, pattern. This is for shape. The stems are kind of a linear thing. Here's another pattern. Now, a lot of these images, I would normally immediately go and make color adjustments, brightness contrast adjustments to enhance them before starting to work with them. This is for texture. So looking at this less as objects and more as formal elements like color, texture, shape, form. Now this image here I originally shot to be texture because of the cracked peeling paint and everything. This is the best example of something being form that I have to work with right now. So with the shading here, I'll work with that. And I might actually go ahead and enhance this slightly to accentuate the light dark shading. Go ahead and clip that to this layer. Now if I go in to the channels, if I go through here, we have a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. So the red channel is a channel of information showing how much red there is for each pixel on the screen. And you can think of that information as a number between 0 and 255 because we're in 8-bit mode. Or you can think of it as what we're seeing here as a grayscale image from black to white. Or you can think of it as redness. If I click on green, you see similar, because this is a fairly grayscale image to begin with. And then blue, a little more high contrast because there isn't much blue in the shadow areas. All right, so if I wanted to look at the luminance of this image, I could actually just take this blue channel because it's a fairly good contrast image from light to dark. So I could load this as a selection if I wanted to select the white parts of the image. So if I control click on the channel here, I could load the blue channel and do something with it here. There are a lot of different things I could do. One thing I could go to like the bark layer here and make a layer mask. And here you see the bark showing through the lightest part and not seeing very much bark in the darker areas. So this is using essentially the luminance, but particularly the blue channel here. I could get luminance more particularly. Let me throw this one away. If I went in here and I threw like a black and white adjustment layer on here, I could dial up what I want. Yeah, that yellow adds some noise I don't particularly want. But I can dial up the black and white image I want. And say, this is what I want for black and white. Then if I go to the channels, I click on red, green, and blue, they're all the same because it's grayscale image. So when you have grayscale, there's an equal amount of red, green, and blue throughout the image. So I could take any one of these and load it as a luminance channel. So if I control click on one of these, I'm going to go ahead and save it and call it luminance. It calls it alpha 1. In computer graphics, for pixels, you had your red channel, green channel, and blue channel, and then if there was a fourth channel, they'd call that alpha. And in Photoshop, you can have any number of channels. So, defaults to alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha 3, but it's better to give it a more descriptive name. So here I've loaded that. Now I want to always go back, so I'm looking at the RGB image, except that I have this black and white filter on there. So I could turn that off, or I don't really need it anymore. I might just throw that in the trash. So I could go back to the bark, for instance, apply that, pretty similar to what we had before. If I want to look at that layer mask, I can just Alt-click on it. This is the layer mask I'm using. Alt-click again to go back to looking at the result. I could enhance this now. Let's say I wanted more contrast in here. I can't add an adjustment layer to the layer mask. I'd have to, as a layer, an adjustment layer, it'd affect everything below or clip to this layer. But I just want to work with this one channel. And I can still do that if I go to Image Adjustments. The adjustments here that are not grayed out are available to use on a black and white image, such as our layer mask. So here I can go and I can change this. I'm essentially removing dark areas. I'm making more black areas here, essentially removing them from what's being visible. You can go in here and remove things and change the white area so there's more of a sharp transition from the light areas to the dark areas. I could also change what I'm looking for. Let's say I want the light areas to be light and the dark areas to be dark, and I want the midtones to be where the bark is. And I could do that if I just bring the let me add a point in there. Okay, if I do something like this, basically we're saying these dark areas we do not want bark. The white areas we do not want bark. And so here we see the white from the underlying image showing through, and the dark areas on the underlying image showing through, and bark only showing up in between. I could make this much more contrasty. And get more of an image where the bark is actually breaking the contours of some of these shapes. And I think that might work for what I'm doing. So I'm just responding to the image, kind of looking at the shapes, the forms, applying different images to different parts. So this is masking the bark layer by using a layer mask based on the luminance of the background layer. I'm going to click OK there. And you see I can look at that layer mask by alt-clicking on it. So this is what my layer mask looks like. Where it's white, we see the bark. Where it's black, we see the background image. All right, so that's an example. Now let's look at using the color channels a little bit differently. I have this image here, which I chose mostly to be shapes. There's some color to work with. I might actually add a little more color contrast in here. Make sure that this is clipped to the layer below. Now what I want to do here is have these leaves floating above the background, essentially. And looking at this, the leaves are yellow. The background is black with white specks. The white specks are going to have red, green, and blue in them. But I'm going to take advantage of the fact that yellow is composed of red and green. So if I can create a selection based on the red and green channels without using a selection tool, I should be able to get the leaf shapes for the most part. So let's take a look at that. If I go into channels, if I click on the red, you see how much red there is in different parts of the image. If I click on green, you see how much green there is, and they're very similar. Some slight differences. If I click on blue, you see this is very low contrast because there's not much blue in the yellow except where it's white. You know, the white has all the colors, red, green, and blue, combined together. So this is a very low contrast image. The green and the red are much closer to the selection that I'm looking for. Now I could load any of these just by control clicking, and now I could create a layer mask based on how red things are. Or I could do the same thing with green. You've seen me do that with the other image. Let me show you another thing. Remember when we were talking about selections, how Shift adds to a selection, Alt subtracts. So one thing I could do is I could hold down the Shift key and control click, so control Shift click on green. I've just added the red and green channels together. Now let me save that. You can see what that looks like. And I'm going to deselect here, get rid of the ants. So this is a more contrasty image than the red or green independently, and brighter. But it's picking a lot of the background up that I don't really want. So I'm just going to go ahead and trash that one. What I'd like to do is select the pixels that are both red and green. That means, i.e. yellow. So I'm going to do the Control-Alt-Shift click on red. Well, to start, I'll just control click on red to load that. And then Control-Alt-Shift click on the green. Let me save that. Take a look at it. And deselect so we get rid of the noise. Now this is kind of contrasty, but I mean that's good. It's like I want more of a selection for the leaves than the background. So I'm going to load this again. Control click, and then click on RGB so I'm seeing the image. Go back to layers, and so with the leaf layer selected, I am going to create a layer mask. And here you see, sort of translucent yellow leaves floating over the background. Now there are a couple things I could do here again. I could go into the curves and enhance the image a little bit, maybe add more color contrast so that they stand out a little more. I could also change the contrast of the layer mask. So with the layer mask selected, again, I can't use curves here, but I can go into Image Adjustments and apply a curve, and you see there's a lot of black in here, and then the different shades, middle gray to white. And I could take out some of the black, and yeah, here I'm adding, more contrast to it. In fact, I'll get rid of that point. So I set the black level where the areas where there is no information from the leaf. And then I can change the contrast of it. And here you see it's more subtle, laid over. If I increase the contrast, it's making the brighter parts of the image more opaque. And so depending on what kind of look I'm going for, I can adjust that to get the layering that I'm interested in. So again, without using any selection tools, I've created a selection based on the information in the channels, and I'm using that to layer one image over the other. Okay, I'm going to hide that. Now, to a certain extent, blending modes do some of the same work for you. So if let's see, that's my stone. What do I have up here? Okay, here I have some other stones. So if I selected this and went into the blending modes, okay, it's on normal, and if you use the down arrow, here we have darken. So this, in a similar way, is using the lightness and darkness of the pixels to make a decision how to layer them. The first ones are darkening. Then you have ones that lighten. So this is still mostly based on luminance, but it's working by channel for the most part. The information in the red channel in one image combined using some sort of math to create a resulting image. So I want to still use blending modes, but then also use masks to have a little bit more control over where I want these different effects. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the ones at the bottom. Like hue, saturation, luminance are also using channels of information, but they're derived ones. Like there is no channel for hue, but that's what's being used here. There's no channel for saturation or luminance, but Photoshop can create like a hue channel and use that. It can create a saturation channel and use that. It can create a luminance channel and use that to get these different effects down here at the bottom. Hue, saturation, color, which is hue, and saturation combined, and luminance. Okay, let's take a look at what we have so far. We've got bark kind of layered into the middle gray areas. Got these leaves floating on top. I've got a brick walk here. It's kind of low contrast. I would normally boost that with something. Let me hide the leaves for a minute here. Let's look at what we could do with the stone walk with different blending modes. Darken. So with darken, you see the white areas being where the brick shows up. Since I kind of like the white from the background showing in the light areas, the bark in the middle tones. I'd like to get the brick mostly in the darker areas. Try to get that to show up in the darker areas of the image. Now right now in overlay we're getting a little bit of that. Hard light's giving us some of that. Vivid light is as well. So going through these I can see if there's something that's going to work for me. Give me a look I like. Now I kind of like that level of brick, but I only want it in darker areas. I don't want it showing up here. So again, I have this luminance channel I created. If I control click on that, I can apply that as a layer mask. And I have the opposite of what I want. It's only showing up in the light areas, not in the dark areas. But I can fix that by selecting the stone walk, going to image adjustments. I could just invert it, or I could just go into curves like I did before. Let me start with just inverting. So that created a negative image. If I alt click on that, here we have a negative image. And I could go in and do brightness contrast adjustment of that. But you see now it's in the darker areas. The bark's in the middle grays, and then the original image is in the light areas. Stone chimney. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to add saturation to this, use this for color. Now I usually start with the vibrance to see what I get with that because it's a little bit more natural. You can also add more saturation. And this is going to be subtle, so I'm going to crank the saturation up a little bit here. And I do want these only affecting the stone, not everything. I mean, they'll end up affecting everything because of how I apply this. So I'm going to select the stone chimney and put this in color mode. Okay, so now we have those saturated colors coming in and affecting everything. Okay, so I'm just responding to the image. I'm not going for anything in particular. I'm just going through some different techniques here. Let's see what we have with our leaves here. Now they're picking up stuff from the layers above. So I'm actually going to take this and drag it up above everything else. So now this color from the stone chimney is affecting the things below. And then we have the leaves up here. Oh, I think this curves was for the leaves. Yeah, bring that back up here. Clip it again to that layer. Okay, so when you drag these around, if you're not careful, like the adjustment layers that are attached to a layer can get separated from them. Okay, so here these curves are only affecting the leaves, and then we see the other things beneath it. And we're kind of getting close to something that I think would be kind of interesting. Although I don't like the overall brightness and contrast. So one thing I want to show here, just as a finishing thing, I do have this other color, blue color layer I could apply. In fact, let me just control click on the leaf layer mask, apply it to this blue pattern here. Now I've added blue to the leaves in normal mode, but I'm going to switch to hue. So it's just taking the hue from that blue pattern layer and adding it to the leaves. And then I'm going to use the opacity to back that off a little bit so it's kind of a blend of the original yellow with the color above. So just different ways of combining things. But now to make some overall adjustments, well, there are different ways I could do this. But I'm just going to go ahead and on top of everything else, I'm going to put curves in here so I can adjust the brightness and contrast. I might want kind of a lower contrast through the middle here, or I might want higher contrast. This is, and you may hate the way this looks totally. I haven't really looked at it that closely to see how much I like it or not. But this is a adjustment layer affecting the entire image because it's on top and it's not clipped to any particular layer. So this is my final version, and these are the sort of techniques converting channels to selections, from selections to layer masks to selections to they're all the same kind of information, and it's all what you're using them for.